Growing up, I always knew that my family was different, not in a good way. My parents, Jack and Sarah, were hardworking, but no matter how much they toiled, it seemed like the universe had a grudge against us. We never seemed to catch a break. Dad worked at a warehouse during the day and pulled night shifts as a security guard, while Mom juggled two jobs, working at a diner and cleaning office buildings after hours. Yet, despite their relentless efforts, we were always on the edge of disaster. I remember nights when the power would be cut off, and Mom would light candles, trying to make it feel like an adventure. But I wasn't stupid. Even at 6 years old, I knew it wasn't normal to live like that. The fridge would often be empty, and I'd overhear whispered arguments between my parents about which bills to pay and which to let slide. The worst was when they fought about food. Not with each other, but over whether Dad should eat enough to keep going at his physically demanding job, or if the rest of us should stretch the little we had. One night, when I was around 7, I found Mom crying in the kitchen. Her head was down, shoulders shaking, the phone still in her hand. Dad stood across from her, his face pale and angry. I didn't understand everything they were saying, but words like eviction, foreclosure, and debt stood out like sharp needles in my chest. A sinking feeling gripped me, and for the first time, I realized just how unstable our lives were. It wasn't just the big things. It was the little humiliations that chipped away at you day after day. My clothes were always hand-me-downs, worn, patched, and far from fashionable. I remember going to school in shoes that were practically falling apart. The soles were peeling off, and I tried to fix them with duct tape, but the other kids noticed. They always noticed. Dumpster Alex, they called me. Where'd you find those shoes, the garbage? I hated the name, but I learned to laugh along, pretending it didn't bother me. What else could I do? By the time I was 10, I realized I had to help. It wasn't fair to leave everything on Mom and Dad when I could see the strain aging them before my eyes. That summer, I started doing odd jobs around the neighborhood. Mowing lawns, shoveling snow, walking dogs, whatever people needed. I wasn't picky. Dad gave me a few tips on negotiating, and Mom always reminded me to smile, even if I felt like crying. Most people were kind enough to give me a few bucks, but there were others who talked down to me like I was some kind of charity case. One summer stands out more than the rest. The fridge was completely empty, and we hadn't had running water for nearly a week. I decided to go door to door asking if anyone needed their car washed or their lawn mowed. Mrs. Callahan, the sweet old lady down the street, handed me $20 with a sad smile. "Go get yourself a proper meal, honey," she said. I nodded, thanked her, and ran straight home to give the money to Mom. She cried when I handed it to her. "Alex, this isn't your burden," she said. I didn't say anything, but I knew better. It was my burden because it had to be done. My best friend Nate came from a family not much better off than mine. He was wiry, always up to something mischievous, and had a knack for making the best out of bad situations. He introduced me to the idea of collecting empty soda cans to trade for cash. One time, we decided to sneak into the junkyard to look for more cans. I'll never forget the way the owner came barreling out of his shack, swinging a crowbar and yelling like a maniac. We barely escaped, and when we finally stopped running, we both collapsed into fits of laughter. It was one of the few genuinely fun memories I had from that time. There was also Sophia, a girl who moved into the neighborhood when I was 11. She had this easy, genuine kindness about her, the kind that felt rare in a world full of judgment. Sophia's family was better off than ours, but she never made me feel lesser. Sometimes she'd sneak me leftovers from her mom's cooking. Real food, the kind you couldn't even imagine when you were used to eating peanut butter sandwiches every day. Other times, she'd lend me books from her massive collection. "You've got to keep your mind busy," she'd say. "It'll help." But life wasn't all adventures and Sophia's kindness. When I was 12, Dad got hurt at work. A malfunctioning piece of equipment crushed his hand, and he couldn't work for months. Without his income, we spiraled even further into debt. I remember the day Mom sat us down and told us we might have to move into a shelter. The fear in her voice is something I'll never forget. Desperation drove me to take risks I wouldn't have considered before. Nate and I started sneaking into construction sites to collect scrap metal to sell. We knew it was illegal, but what choice did we have? One night, we got caught by a security guard. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. Instead of calling the cops, the guy sighed, handed us $50 from his own wallet, and told us not to do it again. That money fed us for 2 weeks. Skipping school became routine. I figured it didn't matter much since my grades were already in the toilet. Instead, I picked up shifts at the local gas station or did gigs wherever I could find them. My teacher started calling home, but Mom and Dad were too overwhelmed to deal with it. Mom used to tell me I was smart, that I could do something great with my life. I wanted to believe her, but how could I think about the future when we barely had a present? Every day felt like survival. Nothing more. By the time I turned 28, I was finally in a position to breathe a little easier financially. After years of grinding through countless jobs and building my career, I'd managed to save enough to help my family in ways I'd only dreamed of as a kid. But what I didn't realize was how quickly that help would turn into an expectation. It started with the $25,000 debt my parents had been drowning in for years. They'd taken out loans during some of the worst periods of our lives, and while they had scraped by, the interest kept growing. When they confided in me that they were barely holding on, I didn't hesitate. The next day, I transferred the money, watching their relief and seeing my dad's shoulders relax for the first time in years. It felt worth every penny. At least that's what I thought at the time. Then Emily, my younger sister, came to me with a dream of her own. Emily was 29, just a year younger than me, and had always been a little different. She was fiercely independent, at least on the surface, but she'd never been great with money. "Alex, I need a car," she announced one evening over dinner at my place. "An electric one. It's better for the environment, and I think it'll help me get around more easily." I laughed at first, thinking she was joking. "You know electric cars aren't cheap, right?" I said, but she wasn't kidding. She pulled out brochures, showing me the exact model she wanted, and $75,000 sleek, futuristic vehicle. "Emily, I can't just drop that kind of money," I told her. "Why not get something more affordable?" But Emily wasn't one to back down. "You can afford it," she said bluntly. "You've got a good job, no kids, no mortgage. I'll pay you back eventually." Against my better judgment, I caved. I convinced myself it was a practical choice, that it would help her get to work and reduce her expenses. But deep down, I knew it wasn't really about practicality. I just couldn't say no to her. Then came Austin, my younger brother. At 27, he was the dreamer of the family. He'd always talked about going to university, but life had gotten in the way. He worked odd jobs here and there, trying to save up, but it was a slow process. "Alex," he said one night over the phone, "I've been accepted into a program, business administration. It's what I've always wanted to do." "That's great, Austin," I said. "When do you start?" "Well, there's just one problem," he admitted. "I don't have the money for tuition. I was hoping you could, maybe help me out, just until I get on my feet." Helping Austin was an easy decision at first. Education felt like a worthwhile investment, and I wanted him to succeed. But when I saw the total cost, $12, $200, it hit me like a freight train. Still, I paid it. I told myself it was for his future, that he'd pay it forward someday. The next big expense came out of nowhere. Mom called me one morning, her voice full of excitement. "Alex, I've been thinking the house could use a little sprucing up." "A little sprucing up?" I repeated skeptically. "Well, more like a lot of sprucing," she said with a laugh. "We could really use a new kitchen. The counters are falling apart, and the cabinets are a mess. Maybe even redo the bathrooms." I'd known Mom and Dad had been talking about renovations for years, but I'd never realized how big of a project it would be. When the contractor's bill came in, it was $50,000, far more than I was prepared to cover. I stared at the invoice, my mind racing. How had I let things get this far? And how could I keep bailing them out without jeopardizing my own future? Now, at 35, I realized that everything I did for my family wasn't just out of love. It was because I felt like I owed them for the sacrifices, for the struggles. It was never about paying them back, but paying forward. I had convinced myself that their happiness, their success was tied to mine. But somewhere along the way, I lost sight of my own dreams. I had helped them survive, but at what cost to myself?